Henry VIII was obsessed with having a male heir to succeed him onto the throne. This quest would lead him to even executing his second wife, Anne Boleyn, so that he could then marry his third wife, Jane Seymour. But Jane had a very tragic demise following giving birth inside of Hampton Court Palace. She gave the king his male heir in the form of Edward VI, but, as mentioned, Jane died. If she had not, then it's likely that Henry would not have become the king who is remembered for having 6 wives, but instead Henry would claim he was in mourning after Jane's death, but he quickly then began to search for another wife, because nothing says moving on like searching for another wife just weeks after the tragic loss of your third. But what did Jane Seymour die from, and what was the story of her postmortem and the embalming process? It is believed that Jane Seymour was killed following a number of complications that had emerged following giving birth to Edward VI, the successor to her husband. During the Tudor period, giving birth was very dangerous, and it came with a lot of different risks, and because of this it was common for women to contract infections and other issues following giving birth, and also labour could go on for a very long time. One man who was present inside of Henry VIII's court was Nicholas Sander, who wrote and reported on what was happening during the king's reign. He was not the biggest fan of the king, but he claimed that around the time of Edward's birth that Jane Seymour was in severe labour in a difficult childbirth, and that all her limbs were stretched for the purpose of making a passage for the child. As others have claimed, having the womb cut before she was dead, so that the child ready to be born might be taken out, the travail of the queen being very difficult, the king was asked which of the 2 lives he wanted spared. He answered the boys, because he could easily provide himself with other wives. With this, the writer is claiming that Jane Seymour may have given birth to the king through means of caesarean section, but there is no evidence that claims this is true, and there were no records of this being performed before the 1580s. But what this writer also claims is that Jane was on death's door when this happened, but other records claim that she was visited following giving birth by other ambassadors, who then documented their meetings with her. There was some evidence that did state that Jane did give birth through this means, as in 1643, a century afterwards, Sir Richard Baker claimed that Jane was in labour for 6 long days, and that she begged doctors to cut her stomach to save her child and to end the process. But as mentioned, this is very unlikely. There were many other more prominent beliefs about her cause of death, and that Jane died from a fever that she sustained during childbirth, which is known as puerperal fever, and she may have also sustained an infection. There are no doctor records of her condition and treatment, however. Now, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, certainly went into labour in the afternoon of the 9th of October 1537, and around 2 a.m. on the 12th of October, Edward, her son, was born. It was claimed that she had signed letters that announced the birth of her son, putting questions about her dying earlier down, and ambassadors visited her in bed at Hampton Court to pass on their congratulations following the christening of Edward. This rules out the use of a caesarean, as she would have needed longer to recover, but as mentioned, this was not used early enough. But 4 days after giving birth to Edward, Jane reported that she was not well. Her physician documented her symptoms as a natural lax, by reason whereof she began to lighten and become more cheerful, and it appeared to mend, and so continued till towards the night. All this night she hath been very sick. Jane did slightly get better, and the next day there were no other reports that she had been suffering until the 19th of October. But then it was mentioned that Jane Seymour had taken a turn for the worse, and her condition then got significantly worse over the weekend. It was then clear to many who visited the Queen that she was not recovering well, and that she was in very severe danger and on death's door. Henry VIII was then summoned to her bedchambers at Hampton Court, and he prayed by his wife's side and stayed with her for some time, until he then left. He knew that his wife was dying, and on the 24th of October 1537 at 2 a.m, Jane Seymour died inside of Hampton Court Palace. The death of Jane was said to have been the fault of them that were about her, and suffered her to take great cold, and to eat things which the fantasy in her sickness called for. But this report claimed that Jane had contracted food poisoning or some sort of stomach issue that caused problems for her. It also claimed that she had a very bad cold which led to a fever, and then led to her dying. During the 16th century, it was common for people to get a cold or a fever, but there was no mention or specific knowledge relating to sepsis or an infection that caused blood poisoning. It is likely that Jane died from some form of sepsis, and prominent historians and medical officials are sceptical that she died from just a mere fever, as it was said that Jane had been seen hosting guests following the christening and eating rich food. They claim also that it was a significant time after that Jane may have contracted a fever from childbirth, but they suggest that the Queen may have had some form of embolism. It was inside of Hampton Court Palace where Jane died, and she would die in the same rooms where she gave birth, an apartment inside of the palace. But after Jane's death, Henry VIII went to Windsor to mourn, and he decided that his third wife should be buried within St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, in a special burial vault. The court was told to dress appropriately in mourning clothes, and they said that Henry VIII was even seen wearing purple, the colour of royalty. But the Duke of Norfolk was told to plan the funeral, and Jane's body was eventually taken from Hampton Court to Windsor Castle, and the King did not attend the funeral service. Jane Seymour had a huge and large funeral, and there were hundreds of masses to be sung for her soul, and Jane's body was embalmed, and this led to the removal of some of her internal organs. Jane's heart and intestines, as well as other organs, were cut out of her body, and then these were placed in separate containers and were then buried inside of Hampton Court's Chapel Royal, close to the altar. Jane's body had been dressed in a robe of gold, and a crown was placed on her head while she lay in state. Her body was taken to Windsor Castle for its burial, inside of the chapel there. Now the funeral procession arrived at the castle on the 10th of November, and there was a large amount of ceremony involved in her funeral. Jane was then laid to rest with the full honours of a queen inside of a small burial vault beneath the Garter Chapel, and her two brothers witnessed the burial. The coffin was lowered into the vault, and her staff broke their staves of office inside of the grave to symbolise the end of their work. But bells rang out for hours across London, and it would be years later that Henry VIII was buried inside of the same vault as Jane Seymour. Over the next few decades and centuries, another burial was placed in the vault, that of the executed King Charles I. But Jane Seymour's coffin was noted to have been in a very good way, unlike that of her husband's, which was known to have been splintered and decayed open, and someone even tried to steal one of his bones. But Jane Seymour's cause of death was presumably a fever that took some time to take hold, or some form of illness that gripped her when she was weak after giving birth. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.